Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today we're going to be doing a video where I'm going to be looking back at the All-USFL team from the 2022 season. Now, there was, I only thought, maybe one snub, as I think a snub is someone who doesn't make the team but should have, but I wanted to go back and actually decide who I think were the top 5 best players that did not make the All-USFL team. Now, just as an FYI, the All-USFL team came out at Week 9, but for this, since I'm just doing the best players who didn't make it, I am counting their Week 10 stats, but I'm not counting their playoff stats, since that's not how it works. So I'm kind of doing like in-betweenish, I guess. So I guess that's pretty much how it's going to be. So as for the All-USFL teams, for those of you who don't remember, the All-USFL special teams had punter Brandon Wright, kicker Brandon Aubrey, punt returner Cavante Turpin, kick returner Maurice Alexander, and special teamer Victor Bolden Jr. Then the All-USFL defense had defensive tackles Toby Johnson and Reggie Howard, defensive ends David Bellamy, Chris Odom, linebackers Gerard Fernandez, Donald Payne, and DeMarcus Gates, corners Will Likely and Channing Stribling, and their safeties were Shalem Luani and Bryce Torneden. And then the offense, last but not least, had quarterback Kyle Sloter, running backs Reggie Corbin and Darius Victor, tight end Sal Cannella, receivers Victor Bolden and Cavante Turpin, offensive tackles Jaron Jones and Terry Poole, guards Cam Hunt and Garrett McGinn, and then center Jared Thomas. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, before we actually get into the list, a couple guys I have honorable mentions. These 4 guys I think were close enough to be on the list, but I don't think they were as deserving as the top 5 guys. Those 4 guys are Reggie Northrup, Case Cookus, Bug Howard, and Frank Gidna. So as for Case Cookus, naturally he became even better in the playoffs, but in terms of the regular season, the fact that he wasn't the starter the whole year really did hurt him. Yes, he ended up only with 1,334 yards, which was 4th in the league, but overall when you look at his numbers compared to a lot of the other guys that were up there with him, like from him and up you had Smith, Slaughter, and Talmu above him, his quarterback rating of 90.1 was substantially higher than everyone else. He also got sacked substantially less, with the only guy being comparable was Slaughter, but his 12-5 touchdown to interception ratio was far better than the guys above him. And I think the fact that he was a consistent starter shows that he does deserve it more than Perez, who naturally, he was, in that 2-quarterback system with that awesome team. I just think Cookus was really solid and definitely deserves an honorable mention. Then, as for Bug Howard, he actually had more receiving yards than Sal Cannella at tight end. And it wasn't by much, it's literally by 3 yards, but he did. But he also had 2 more touchdowns than Bug, and he did it on 4 less receptions. So I think that he definitely deserves an honorable mention. And then the 2 defensive linebackers. To put it simply, Frank Gidna was your prototypical solid middle linebacker, just a lot of tackles. He was second in the league at 90 total tackles. And he did have 6 TFLs. He did get 1 sack and 1 pass defense. He didn't make the list just because of the fact that he was just a prototypical linebacker. And Reggie Northrup, as for him, even though he was only 5th in tackles during the league, overall he was part of that defense of the Gamblers that was so dominant for a while, as he did force a fumble and he had 2 recoveries for touchdowns. So he did score 2 touchdowns for his team. So I think he definitely deserves it. And I think those guys all get nice honorable mentions. I just don't think that they're good enough to actually make the list. Coming in at number 5 is the only guy that I actually looked at as a snub when the list originally came out, and that's Lance Lenoir. Looking back, I think it was just because of at the time and stuff like that, but overall, Lance Lenoir now, I'm putting him at 5th. I think that he overall had a really great season. He did definitely get fed the ball a bit. His 52 receptions was by far the most of everybody in that area, as he did lead the league in receptions. And take that with what you will in your regards to receptions, but his 190 yards after catch were still a solid amount. But he's getting targeted 88 times and only catching 52, depending on how much you want to blame his quarterbacks. The Panthers didn't have a full-time legit, everyone looked him as good starting quarterback till Paxton Lynch's literal last game in Week 10. So the fact that he was able to get these stats is pretty solid. He did have 2 receiving touchdowns. So I think that he definitely deserves to be one of the guys that was, the best players to not make it. As I think him and another receiver on this list, genuinely looking back and still, I think both deserve to be the receiver over Victor Bolden Jr. As I said, when it happened, Victor Bolden, I felt like always got it because he was on the Stallions, and that's why, the coaches and people voted for him. But Lance Lenore, fifth on this list. Coming in at number 4 is the other receiver in Marlon Williams. Yeah, I put both of them right next to each other because they're both really close. Marlon Williams, as you can see, had literally 10 less receiving yards, but he did it on 20 less receptions. But his percentage of targeted passes to Kopp was less than him. But his yak was a little bit less by 4 yards. But his average receiving yards were higher. But his touchdowns were 4. That's what drove him for me. The fact that he did have 4 touchdowns. Because of that, I said, you know what? Sure, and put him above him. As 4 touchdowns was, that massive tie for second place. So I will put Marlon Williams at 4th. I don't think either of these two receivers were substantially better than than a lot of other people. So that's why they're 5 and 4. But they both definitely deserve to be on here. And Marlon Williams just, especially considering how he finished the year, he was unarguably better receiver than Bolden. I mean, you can say eye test, stuff like that. The bottom line is the guy had 60 more yards than Victor Bolden Jr. and 3 more touchdowns. He was definitely better than Bolden. It's just that, Bolden was, that overall kind of multi-purpose guy, and that's why he got a lot of help, but that's just me. Overall, that's pretty much it for Marlon Williams. Coming in at number 3 is going to be Adam Rodriguez. I've always said that Adam Rodriguez has always felt like an underrated player, and I don't think he became, known until the postseason. But overall, his season was quietly really solid. If you just compare his numbers to Odom, and you just look at this part of the stats, he almost is, close to him and everything. He has the same TFLs. He's literally 1 tackle behind, which was 1 solo tackle, and he's only 3.5 sacks behind, which, just as an FYI, is 2.5 sacks more than 3rd place. And then for the yards, yeah, Odom's sacks, did generate a bit more yards. But then we go to the other stats is when you do see that there's something else, forced fumbles, he only had 2 to Odom's 6. Pass defenses, he did beat him by 1, and he did get a safety. But Odom, as we all know, also blocked, multiple kicks during the year. But Rodriguez overall was an insanely great end and just overall edge rusher. And looking back, it's another thing where it sometimes shows that the coaches, it's hard to go against because this list was pretty much made by the coaches when they did this. But looking back, it's hard to see how they put Davin Bellamy ahead of Rodriguez. I know that Bellamy didn't play every single game, but the fact is Rodriguez totally beat him in stats. He had 3.5 more sacks. He had the same amount of tackles, but he did have 1 more TFL. And as for Bellamy, he only had 1 forced fumble, 1 pass defense, and no safeties. Rodriguez was he was different. He was just really, really solid edge rusher. And arguably, I could put him at 2, but I think the top 2 guys above him, just in overall sense, were better. But Rodriguez was definitely deserving of being the 3rd best player and not make the All-USFL team. Coming in at number 2 is Jordan Ellis. Jordan Ellis was on the New Orleans Breakers. He ended up actually leading the entire league in rushing yards. That's really solid. It wasn't by a ton, but he was 4 off 600, but he still did lead the league in rushing. His average rushes, of 4 yards per carry isn't the best, but overall he was a pretty, much just a bell cow back. And then the guy himself, he did only fumble the ball 1 time, which showed that he really was pretty careful with the ball, and he didn't even lose the fumble. And overall, his receiving game is where it definitely tapers off a bit. He only did have 83 receiving yards, which definitely could be better. But there's 697 or 79 all-purpose yards is definitely really solid. Overall, he's just one of those guys who is a very solid player at his position. He led the league in rushing yards, and he definitely deserves to be mentioned as one of the best players to not be on the team. As pretty much Reggie Corbin and Darius Victor, for those who don't know, the reasons that they made it was pretty much because Darius Victor scored literally 9 touchdowns, which was by far the most for rushing and just overall the most. in the league. And then Reggie Corbin had an insane 5.5 yards per carry. But overall, Jordan Ellis was really, really solid and definitely deserves to be the second best player to not make it. Coming at number one, and honestly, I don't think it should be a surprise, is Trey Williams. Trey Williams was the lightning to Darius Victor's thunder on the New Jersey Generals. Overall, Trey Williams actually ended up beating Victor by 2 yards for the rushing title for the Generals, though he did score 7 less touchdowns, which naturally, thick thighs save lives, as Darius Victor has taught us. But overall for Williams, he had a better comparing him really to Victor and Ellis, as you can see, Williams had a very, 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 very solid rushing yards per attempt at 4.9, which is really insane to have. And he did end up having 160-yard rush during the season. But most importantly, he did not fumble the ball. Across his 118 attempts, he never fumbled the ball a single time. Not to mention, when you actually add in his receiving stats, he ended up having 126 receiving yards, which isn't a ton, but it does put him in the top 50. It puts him at 44th in the league. So he overall had 768 all-purpose yards. And to put it simply, it's just he was really, really great for that team. That combination of him and Victor, as well as their two quarterbacks, it was a great strategy that should have, actually used in the playoffs. But Trey Williams, I definitely think, was the best player to not make it on the All-USFL team. I think when you just compare it, he definitely beats out Ellis just head-to-head in a lot of these stats, especially when you add in the receiving, giving him more total yards than Ellis had. And then when you also add in the fact that he didn't fumble the ball, as that's Ellis only fumbled once, Williams didn't fumble. That's impressive. So I think it's really solid. And then I think that's pretty much it for the list, I would say. In terms of the honorable mentions, I will say that I think Bug Howard definitely would be that 6th place guy. I think he was a bit better than the other 3 honorable mentions. But as for the top 5, that's pretty much how I think of it. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. If you like this list, if there were anyone else you think was a top player and not make the All-USFL team. As always, this has been ZomFox. If you enjoy this content, subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, have a great night.